Are you ready for real history? After nearly 2 years of nothing, Byron Lewis has returned. Tonight, you're going to see the biggest, most epic battle in history. It's a battle of life and death, good versus evil. Behold the epic legacy of trousers. After that intro, I'm going to need some new ones.
On with the show. I'm paying you to do this. Get on with it.
Okay.
Do I have to seriously come down and kick your ass?
I regret coming back already.
Hello wenches, and welcome back to History Mystery. I'm Byron Lewis. I've disappointed you all, haven't I? You're expecting something fun and sexy, and you're getting trousers, or pants. Well, I'm going to show you that there is something sexy about pants.
Yes, he's right, there is. Where would we be without trousers? Oh, they're definitely in my top 10 items of clothing. I feel like we take the history of clothing very much for granted, especially trousers. It's not something everyone really thinks of when you say history, is it? I mean, let's be honest, when you think history, you're thinking this, or this, but never this! And sadly, when it does come up, the history of trousers, or costume history as a whole, tends to look like, well, this.
Hello everybody, hiya and welcome to The Guaranteed Historian. Welcome to part 87 of Hitler's uniforms from Hitler's perspective. As many of you know, the Nazis famously wore uniforms, and they were all kind of uniforms that kind of looked like this, and then they kind of looked like that. The Allies also wore uniforms, but I don't think you're as interested in that bit of history because I know my audience on the damn low. In the Battle of Stalingrad, both sides famously wore clothes and also fought each other. Bracket 55 bracket. Thank you for watching today on Guaranteed Historian. Make sure you buy a coffee cup with my face on it and come back next week for Guaranteed Historian part 55 of Dunkirk from Mao Zedong's perspective.
Just so we're clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with liking military history or, if I'm completely honest, being very fixated on one part of military history. I just don't think it's all of history.
It should go without saying that history is many different disciplines, and the history of costume and fashion is just as valid, and I would argue just as eye-opening, as any other form of social history. And anyone who dismisses it outright or tells you that it's not real history is selling you a lie.
Anyway, trousers. As we probably all know on some level, the sort of trousers we all wear today must be a fairly new invention. Now, if television has taught us anything, it's that every single person in medieval Europe wore tights until suddenly everyone started wearing 501s. But what really happened? What's the mystery in this history? I'd like to apologise to the world.
Well, before we get into that, I think we should actually establish something important. Someone actually had to come up with the idea of trousers. They didn't just appear magically or come out in the wild. Someone, somewhere, had to come up with these bad boys. Trousers are a constructed garment. That is to say that you have to stitch them together in a certain way for them to work. Speaking of trousers, let's get on with that story. And I'm gonna need some help to move my bloody leg. Oh God.
In the year 1200 BCE, there was a place called the Tarim Basin. It still exists actually, it's in modern-day China. It was here just a few decades ago that archaeologists discovered the earliest preserved pair of trousers that dated back to this time, worn by the nomadic tribespeople of the ages. While slightly out of the scope of things today, you may already be aware that said nomadic steppe tribes were pretty well known for one important discovery. You could use horses for stuff. People absolutely loved their horses, but the horses wouldn't really say the same about them. Just 3 months ago, I was running around the Central Asian steppe just minding my own business. Now I'm carrying people's bags around, and now I've got a man on my back. Where do these people get off? Well, they don't get off me, that's the bloody problem. Tarim, it's time to deliver some goods and services across the country. In order to ride these horses, though, they needed good clothes to do it. Trousers were likely constructed and invented specifically for this reason. Trousers, when you think about it, are kind of necessary to ride a horse.
Now, I may talk like I can ride a horse, I may walk like I can ride a horse, I may even dress like a member of the village people, but unfortunately, I can't ride a horse, so I have no idea if it would be any use to wear trousers. I'm going to assume yes. It sounds a bit grim. You don't have anything to protect you from chafing. Ugh. So to stop this massive problem, trousers had to be invented.
Now, with a bit of inference, this would suggest that trousers were widespread among the tribes as early as 1200 BCE, but they could have been wearing them for way longer. We weren't there, so we don't know. In order to find the earliest cases of people actually discussing trousers, we have to look slightly later at the Amazons. The Amazons were a civilization of evil women the Greeks talked about a lot that probably didn't exist. The Scythians, however, were a real civilization of evil women that the Greeks talked about a lot, and were probably the inspiration for the Amazons. Scythians, as a whole, were a disparate band of nomadic Central Asian tribes, and these Central Asian tribes flitted and darted all across modern-day Romania and Ukraine. They would, however, get into scraps with the Greeks, which the Greeks were very keen to write about. In a contemporary Greek comedy, the Scythians, who are always portrayed as idiots, are described as wearing sarabara. By process of elimination, we're pretty sure that the Greeks were talking trousers. Shockingly, these people, who were mainly on horseback, also wore these trouser things. And it appears that by 600 BCE, most of their neighbours would come to wear trousers too, which the Greeks really didn't like.
You see, the trouser exclusionary radical Hellenists really didn't like trousers. They're way too feminine, they thought. How dare these people come over from the hills and tell us how to live our lives, they thought, whilst invading them. Oh no, that'd be terrible. Can't have that. Ugh.
You see, a lot of the nomadic tribes were a lot more gender balanced than the Greeks. Historians also believed that the Scythians viewed gender in a fairly ephemeral and fluid way, in a way that's kind of similar today to non-binary finery. When you're a small society and you only have a few of you hanging around, you can't really afford to discriminate. You don't have that luxury. You don't have that abundance of supply that makes you picky. You know, like the Greeks had. Even as a big tribe, you couldn't really afford to tell half of your workforce not to bother. So for the women, that meant donning slacks and getting on the fucking horse. But as we all know from modern times, if a culture does something a bit differently, it is still wrong. Speaking to Hello magazine, Herodotus vehemently decried the garments. When pressed for question, he said that they were the tools of effeminate barbarians.
And they couldn't be more wrong. None of the fembarbs I've ever met in my life could ride horses. They're all bad bitches, sure, but none of them are horse girls. Well, actually, come to think of it, some of them are horse girls, just not like that.
The Greeks were just too triggered by their non-binary energy. Instead, it was way more civilized to wear this big dress-like thing called a chiton. The Greeks loved these because you could look up it to find out what genitals people have. I'm not making that up, by the way, that was a classic Hellenic defense in the culture war against trousers. Upskirting. And of course there was something even more civilized. Introducing the kinodesme. Just wrap a cord around your waist and then tie it to your penis. I swear this is not some kinky thing, this is what they actually did. They really were an interesting bunch of perverts.
However, this aversion definitely wasn't going to be happening everywhere. While the Greeks were definitely being put off it, and obviously getting off to it, nearby Celts thought they were bloody marvellous, likely becoming the first trouser-wearing Europeans. And on the other side of the world, the Chinese were eyeing up the Xiongnu Confederacy's trouser-wearing anarchy.
During the brutally complicated period of the Warring States, none of the Chinese dynasties were really putting up a great defense to the Xiongnu Confederacy. Their gowns and robes were getting in the way, they just kept tripping up over each other on the battlefield. This eventually caused some leaders to take notice. While these trouser things were considered strange and perverse by the Chinese people as well, their kings, emperors and military leaders were really tired of losing, so they wanted to give these hot new trouser things a go. The sides that adopted the trousers quickly developed their cavalry skills, and shockingly, the winners of the Warring States conflict wore trousers as a result. But they weren't the only military that thought trousers were cool. Historians believe that by the 1st century BCE, Romans were wearing trousers for cavalry, having simultaneously learnt the lesson that the Chinese states did. If you want to win things, you need to be wearing some slacks. Historians believe that by the 1st century Anno Domini, the Roman military had begun to wear trousers, or as they called them, brachae.
Historians aren't entirely sure when military trousers began to be taken off. To take off, even. Historians aren't entirely sure when trousers began to take off in the military. What we do know is that they shortened them and they tightened them. They essentially became a pair of shorts. So what's the bloody point?
Whilst stealing the rest of Greek culture and passing it off as their own, they initially took on the trouser hatred too. Especially in civilian life, wearing trousers was seen as completely ridiculous. I mean, why wouldn't you wear a tunic if you had the choice? I know I would. Don't judge me. They really didn't like the looseness of the barbarian Germanic and Celtic cultures, going as far to coin a phrase you might have heard before. Trousered Gauls. Or in Romanese, Galli Bracati.
It may sound completely ridiculous, but trousered Gaul was considered one of the most offensive slurs of the time. It was like, well... I mean, where do these Celts think they can get off dressing like this, so sillily and provocatively? How do they have the gall to do such a thing? Oh, it's a comedy police again. Now, I do want to give people a little bit of a warning here. Unfortunately, the best sources we have from the time are predominantly focused on Western Europe, and generally people in the higher classes of society. There's going to be a lot of things missed out, unfortunately. I'm sorry, but I felt like it was important that you knew this, rather than, you know, being led to assume that people just didn't bother wearing trousers.
The Romans believed that they got the idea of trousers from the Germanic tribes, who in turn were given the idea by the Celts, and who probably got it from the Scythians. But what we do know is that by the 4th century, trousers were pretty much commonplace all across Western Europe. As societies, tribes and civilizations fell, the trousers stayed put, even if it had, in its migration to nomads to not nomads, suddenly become shorter. The Anglo-Saxons used them too, likely picking them up from earlier Germanic tribes. As the centuries wore on, a new trend began to emerge too. If you're not on horseback all the time, why don't you wear them underneath something else? This was the trend initially popularised by the Byzantines, whose fancy robe wearing over trousers slowly began to influence other cultures like the Franks in the late 1st millennium. The materials of trousers have changed over time too. We went from the more rugged and practical wool trousers of the last 1500 years to linen trousers for rich people and smaller garments for everyone else. That's not to say the military use of long trousers hadn't gone out of fashion, of course. You can't really improve on perfection after all. As evidenced by the Bayeux Tapestry, the Normans presumably wore long, open-legged trousers. So you know what that means. My depiction of William the Conqueror, historically accurate. Trousers persisted through the Middle Ages, and by the 13th century in medieval Europe, it had taken some very interesting forms. Most of medieval Europe had opted for tight-fitting, tight-esque trousers known as hose.
Europe loved hose, just not this. The Dutch, famous for their hose. Germans also loved a bit of hose as well. The French, oh, of course they loved them. And the English pretended they didn't like hose, but were just as dirty as the rest of Europe. What can I say? Hose were very popular, and so were these types of trousers.
But don't think that hose were the only option on the table. Other trousers are available. Another form of trousers worth mentioning were braies. These braies were much more like today's trousers. Rather than hose that went on at the feet, these ones hung down from the waist. What an innovation! However, there was a bigger problem afoot. If everyone was wearing hose, how do you tell the poor people apart from your rich friends? I know! Ban all the clothes for the poors! These laws, known as Sumptuary laws, became extremely popular all across Europe, and hose increasingly became a target for them. Hose were increasingly designed to become tighter and higher, especially in Italy. These tighter, sculpted clothes cost a lot more money, and left people with less money to pay for things, especially dowries, aka the good old tradition of buying your wife from her family. Obviously, the best solution to this age-old problem is to ban the heretic trousers forever.
Trousers throughout history have been used as a radical symbol of equity and equality, not just for gender but also for class. It also has been used as a tool of conformity as well. It's fascinating how much control a society can have over its people just through the medium of costume. There's a PhD thesis in there I've just given you for free. If you do it, I'll turn up to your Viva Voce. Guaranteed!
While this was happening for the common folk of Europe, another European trend began to develop too. With the traditional hose being the dominant force in lower Euro garments, people wanted to experiment with the tried and tested formula. The rich wanted to connect their tight hose to their pourpoint jackets over the top. This resulted in the proliferation of the joined hose. They had the joined seams like the earlier French design, but the joined hose now had a hole in the middle reserved for a hot new trend. The codpiece! And while we're on the subject, I need to talk about codpieces.
Until researching this show, I had no idea that codpieces were as, well formed as they are. The idea for most codpieces is that they provide a bit of relief for your genitals. The one problem with their design, especially in coats of armour however, is they gave you the impression that you kind of enjoyed the armed conflict a little bit more than you intended. And I thought all the armour was compensating for something. I mean, bloody hell.
The joined hose enjoyed popularity for another century or so until trends once again began to change. The hose would eventually give way to what became known as breeches during the 16th century. Hang on, breeches, braque, oh my god, it's all connected! These hot new breeches stopped to just below the knees, were fastened to the knee, and included a built-in codpiece as an added bonus. All that and more for just the low price of everything. And of course they're related to
And if you wanted lower knee protection, once again you really needed to have two garments. This is what's known as bifurcation. Not to be confused with a furry's multi-gender holiday escapade, of course.
And we're just going to have to pause there. There is a breaking news story straight out of Italy. We will cut to that. Have we got it?
Yeah, we've got it.
Okay, well, let's cut to that now then.
I'm outside on the streets of Rome, where the authorities have just announced the latest case of commedia dell'arte.
It's been feared for decades. Pestilent populist theatre spewing out of the pews and into the hearts and minds of the public. You've heard of the four humours. Thanks to commedia dell'arte, that number stands at 12.
Dozens of stock characters have appeared all across the city's theatres, causing panic, distress, and many other adjectives.
All across Italy there have been protests against the movement, some as radical as standing near the performers to hear what they have to say. Even the Italian Prime Minister could barely contain his rage.
The most notable case has been Mr. Pantalone of Venedig, who critics have described as difficult, stingy, and for some reason wearing this weird red onesie thing that we can't quite understand yet.
The commedia dell'arte performers have been made to wear face masks. However, it's not enough to stop the spread. But these trousers have already proven to be popular. Already it's a trend on TikTok, and God knows where else. Will Pantalone's trousers take off across the world? That remains to be seen.
We don't have answers, but oh, we have so many questions.
News 24, Rome.
Anyway, the days of two trouser components, or bifurcated trousers, has to come to an end.
I mean, look at them. They were cumbersome, clunky, and in many ways a visible sign of opulence. It was style over substance in every way, but that didn't stop most of Europe from loving them without question. Well, except one notable kingdom heading for some trouble with their ruling class. In pre-revolutionary France, the upper-class complication of ridiculous trousers was a reminder of one simple maxim.
Pittance. Pittance. You own nothing.
And once Paris had burned, or rather revolutionised itself, the revolutionaries widely adopted a new, rigid, work-ready undergarment. They went to the end of the leg like modern trousers, but were generally a lot more loose, and were way simpler than the increasingly stupid breeches. They became known as pantaloons after a certain needy fellow from Italy. He's spreading, guys. Quick, close everything down again. In the French language of French, knee breeches were known as culottes, and so these items without culottes were known as sans-culottes. There we go, you're going to pass GCSE French now. You may have heard the term sans-culotte before. That's because it eventually became a term to identify the entire proletariat. And trousers are actually still called pantalon en français today. Wow, 2 whole words, you're going for the A-level.
Now there's just one important piece to this story that's missing here. The French working class were actually wearing trousers for decades before the sans-culotte movement was really in full swing. It would be extremely inaccurate to suggest that the sans-culottes personally invented long trousers. What they did do, however, is take it from a necessity of working class French life and make it chic, as the French would say.
If you wanted something to take off in French culture, the upper class had to go with it too. And the French upper class, just like the rest of us, love a bad boy. So they decided to stick with the revolutionary longer trousers.
Pantaloons in many ways are the missing link between the trousers of then and the trousers of now. They were the trendsetters, the fire starters. The other buzzword I could put in here to make it a perfect rule of 3. They were all of that, and they were trailblazers.
After their French premiere, the pantaloon quickly spread to England. And in a surprisingly quick amount of time, breeches were kicked to the curb. Pantaloons very quickly dominated European style, especially in Britain. With the upper class of British society, tailored pantaloons became en vogue. The great male renunciation, not some sort of euphemism, was a fashion movement of the time that took joy in the minimal simplicity of trousers. One of the biggest differences between the tailored pantaloons of then and the trousers of now are these buttons down the side that fasten the trouser to the leg. Eventually, a looser garment with less form emerged that could go all the way down to the ankles, and eventually these garments became known as trousers.
The exact moment of transition between pantaloons and eventually trousers in English is very hard to measure.
And of course I'm glossing over the development of the word trouser itself, from its Gallic root of trouver that we mentioned earlier, that entered into Scots as trews or trouse, and then eventually became trouser, and then trousers. Oh, I guess I haven't glossed over it. What I can say is that by the 19th century, people were definitely saying trousers.
One of the earliest books I could find, but by no means the first, was John Wood's 1847 guide for cutting trousers in every description and style. This would suggest that by the 1840s, trousers was the accepted English word that people would understand. Now, I need to talk about this book for a second because I did start reading it, and while it was very interesting, and the content of the book is pretty useful, I have to talk about the typesetting and this opening cover, solely because it's very much the 1840s example of graphic design is my passion. I mean, look at it, every single line of text on the front page is a different font. And think about it, this isn't just changing the settings in Publisher back then. This is actual different typesets being put on the same page, constantly having to change it. It'd be an absolute nightmare to print, but it was on purpose. It looks awful. It looks like a crap website from the 90s. It's giving Fabricland. Wait, you're not from Hampshire and you don't know the magic of Fabricland. Let me introduce you.
Wow, it's fabric. Look at all these fabrics you can buy. I love the colour scheme, it's so easy on the eyes. My retinas, they do be dying. They are great though. Big up the Fabricland Massive. But this is just the West, by which I mean the United Kingdom and France. What about the rest of the world? Did they catch up to us? Did I ask that deliberately leading question on purpose? Of course. The truth is that plenty of cultures had adopted a trouser-style garment and kept them long before the Anglo-French upper class decided that we invented them. It wasn't a magical rediscovery. Many cultures changed them up and did what they wanted with them. Within the Ottoman Empire, a wide variety of outfits containing trouser-esque garments were widespread, though in modern-day Turkey the shalvar, a floatier and baggier pantaloon, was commonplace until Ataturk's rule. This was decades, if not centuries, before sans-culottes ditched breeches and aristos renunciated themselves in front of all of us. The history of the shalvar can be traced back to Central Asia, to horse-riding nomadic Turkic peoples. Yes, it may have been a few hundred generations, but those horseback nomads are back at it again. Those horses must be well chuffed. And with those nomads at the root of this all, there are so many related garments. Every culture that came into contact with them made their own changes to it. The shalwar of Pakistan and Afghanistan, the Punjabi shalwar, the Ukrainian sharovari, and countless others. And where does the word shalwar come from? The word shalvar was originally a Farsi loanword which had developed in the Persian languages from a word they borrowed from Latin, who likely borrowed it from the Greeks. Sarabra. It's funny how everything's connected like that. A lot of the literature out there on trousers barely mentions anything west of Germany. I never thought that this would play into it at all before, naively, but Orientalism, that is, in the West is culturally superior and more liberal than the East sense of the word, really affects how the story of how trousers came to be is told. I wish I had more to go on here, but the limits start with the materials from the experts. And with that, let's go back to Britain. Sorry. As the years went on, people were just happy with them and didn't really want to do anything. Edward VII of England really got into the idea of cuffed trousers. Yes, something about trousers I'd completely taken for granted until I wrote this script was in fact something that was invented and had to be popularised. Until this end, pantaloons and even early modern trousers just ended. And it took until Edward for someone to come along and cuff the buggers, giving us the defined ending we know today. Of course, he as king single-handedly invented this, as bestowed onto him by God. On the other side of the world, Levi Strauss and Jacob Davies were fiddling around with some denim one day and accidentally made a perfect pair of 501s by mistake. Levi had no choice but to bring these bad boys to market, with their stocks quickly depleted by British people with awful hair. Seriously, what the fuck is that carpet?
Speaking of carpets, I have a rug to pull out from under you. It won't come off. Have you noticed something? A truth dangling out there, flopping out for all of us to see. Yes, the trousers had very quickly become a tool of men to men about the place.
I get to say the word. Yes, I get to say it. I get to say the P word. Are you ready? Patriarchy. And unfortunately so. Women had almost entirely stopped wearing them, even going back to the Roman period. Women in the West had been largely stripped of their autonomy and right to wear trousers should they wish. I'm sure this rejection of bodily autonomy and representation in the workplace was their idea. It is of course an active choice to not let women take part in things. It took active work over the last 2 centuries for women to win this fundamental right back. Interestingly, one of the earliest Western movements to give women the ability to have the freedom to wear trousers was directly inspired by the shalvar we mentioned earlier. Women in the 19th century were encouraged to wear dress that in many cases was actively painful or harmful, like extremely tight corsets. A need for a new costume emerged, and a trouser based on the shalvar design ended up being adopted by proto-feminists, and popularised by suffragist Amelia Bloomer. Newspapers at the time mocked them, nicknaming them bloomers and calling the women who wore them Amazons. The social pressure ensured they weren't adopted widely. It would take several decades of dedicated activism all across Western Europe for women to finally re-earn the right to wear trousers. And of course, we in the West, the most liberal, the most enlightened, we did it first, right? Right? I want to show you something quickly. This is a picture from the Ottoman Empire in around 1871. From the same decade, this document was issued to French women who occasionally were allowed to wear trousers, a permission slip to wear trousers. And do you want to know when trousers were banned for women? 1800, after the sans-culottes, and after the French Revolution. It can be nice and comforting to think of history as a linear series of events leading us to liberal enlightenment. But that's hardly true. It's true that the modern trousers that we wear today are a product of relaxing Western attitudes, but it's important to acknowledge that that was not universal. We were a far cry away from what plenty of other cultures have been doing for generations. It's wrong to say that the trouser of today is a Western invention. The trousers you're wearing right now are a product of everyone, of seemingly every culture. There is a little piece of all of us in this garment. Seemingly every culture has had their part to play in its story. The trouser is not a Western invention, it is a world invention. Right, I'll get off my soapbox and I'll stop being deep, I promise. I promise.
In short, the trouser is a pretty great invention. And there's just so many odds and ends in this story that I didn't get to cover here, along with the many, many different branches and evolutions and whatnot of the trouser across the world. And above all else, I hope that I've got you interested in appreciating this story. I want to wrap this up by sharing some of my feelings about something, about what constitutes as real history, especially in the sphere of internet history.
Reading about the history of trousers, researching for big gaps in what we know and what we don't, answering questions for myself and understanding the context of how it all came together was the most interesting research that I've ever done for this show, far more interesting than any war of one person. The history of fashion or costume is as valid an area of history and archaeology as any other, and it's a pity that it doesn't get more coverage on the internet.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there, including other pop historians, who wouldn't say the history of trousers is real history, or that people who cover it are in some way not real historians. Not actual academic historians, of course, I'm talking about internet people. I guess this has now served as a thesis statement for the rest of History Mystery. Wars bore me, people don't. That doesn't mean I'm not going to cover wars and battles and that sort of thing, but expect a slightly more human focus than just focusing on the tanks and the battles and the whatnot. Our history can sometimes be very reductively taught as a series of events that happened in linear order and uniformly. But they didn't. They are as messy, scruffy, untidy as the people that lived through them, and they're just as flimsy, malleable and manipulative as the people who tell you it. And that's really what I want to get across to you. Trousers have come a long, long way, and they've surely spread themselves all over the world in ways that you didn't think were possible. Just like your mum. Good night. Anyone? No? Just Moi? Just Moi? Just me? Oh, hello. It's me. It's been me all along. Hopefully you're enjoying this little episode of History Mystery, and if you are, you can get it straight from the horse's mouth over on patreon.com/Byron Lewis. Look at my horse. My horse is amazing. Give it a lick. It tastes just like raisins.